Nosson zesfenu meden olosulupu prosoligones titozen totelos ochronos.
So welcome. Thank you again for being here and taking some time to talk with me.
Oh, glad to be here with you.
So we had a few questions we thought we might explore at the beginning. Some of them are really broad and maybe too broad to be answered. But the first was, what might students who are interested in Greek philosophy from antiquity want to know about, like, the much wider world and continuity of Greek culture as a whole, like through the Byzantine period and down into modernity? Any stories that might be good to start with?
I love starting with stories that are perhaps on the margins of the actual subject, not that is in a discussion on the reception of Aristotle or Plato, but might still, by virtue of what they tell, give us a bit of a hint of how philosophy travels. Maybe that's a good title, How Philosophy Travels.
That sounds like a great start.
And I would like to give an example that I love giving to my students and to friends who might ask me from experience. So we're in the 9th century, and under the reign of Emperor Theophilos, who's an iconoclast. So he participates in this great debate and discussion about the position of icons in Byzantium, and he's against them. He thinks they're idolatrous. They remind you of all these pagan Greeks. Keep in mind, this guy would define himself, even though he speaks Greek, not as a Greek, but as a Roman. He is the emperor of the Romans in the 9th century, even though you might think the Roman Empire has collapsed. But you know, that's a very peculiar statement. It's about the West, not about the East. So, yes. So we're in the reign of Theophilus. And a historian who writes in the 10th century tells us that during that time, during a war between Byzantium and the Caliphate, so the great Muslim state next to Byzantium to the south and east, the Caliph captures one of the soldiers who is taken to Baghdad, and people recognize that he's educated. And he's brought to the palace of the Caliph, and they realize that this guy has serious mathematical skills, serious understanding of math. And he starts competing with the local sort of Arab superstars of math. And the Caliph says, so who are you, the impressive? I mean, what's the story with you? Oh, I am nothing. I'm kind of good, but you know, my teacher is Leo the philosopher, who is back home in Romania, in the country of the Romans, a Greek-speaking philosopher again. So here you have this story about the philosopher. The Caliph sends a notice to the emperor and says, can I get your guy? It's almost as if, you know, the Ivy League is going to the smaller school that has a star teacher and say, recruit this guy. And it is really this kind of balance. Yeah, and it is this balance of power, of course, because the Caliphate is the world empire at the time. Byzantium, for all the Roman Empire, it's much smaller. And the emperor at that stage, according to the story, of course, it's a constructed story, turns and thinks, wait, I have this treasure next to me. Let's keep him. How do I keep him? This philosopher in a court. And he has to offer him a job. Obviously, he's not going to offer him an academic job, but he makes him bishop of Thessaloniki. So the second largest city of the empire. So here you have these. I think about what we have here. We have a Greek-speaking Roman Empire talking to the Caliph in Baghdad, who's, by the way, participating in one of the largest movements of translation of Greek texts, many of them philosophical, from Greek to Arabic. And he's talking to the Byzantine emperor, who's the ruler of a Roman Empire that is Greek-speaking, and they're competing about recruiting a star philosopher who also is very good in mathematics. Now, Leo the philosopher, or the mathematician as he's known, and by the way, let's clarify that a mathematician in the Middle Ages is not just a math guy. He could be an astrologer. So he's not just a philosopher, he's also an astrologer, and he's interested in the divination of from the skies and so on and so forth.
So this is
becomes
pretty
bishop of
practical,
a
like
church.
applied mathematics, lots of
Exactly.
important practical things. Okay.
Mm-hmm. You study a sequence of events that you observe in nature in order to predict the future. So that's what he's doing, and he becomes a bishop. And our sources eventually tell us, and I think we have some couplets from his sermons. He goes into his church and he starts delivering Platonic number theory on his flock. So here you have then, I think in our preliminary discussion, you were saying how you started with Homer and Hesiod in the class, and you're beginning a conversation of pre-Socratics and eventually going into the classical era from the archaic and getting into the beginnings of a philosophical tradition in the Greek world. And here we are, something like more than a millennium later, 1300 years later or something, people in a world that geographically is very close to the world you're discussing right now, but a world that imagines itself as Roman, a world that is Christian. And our Enlightenment ideas about Christianity and philosophy are fairly stark, simplistic, we would say. A world that is Christian that still values philosophical thinking. That philosophical thinking, which some Christian thinkers might find tricky to deal with, that the more conservative elements in the church might find problematic, but nonetheless philosophical thinking that finds its way all the way into the church, whether as Platonic number theory or as direct influence on the way theology is constructed. So I think this is a good way to begin the conversation, maybe a long way, but I always find it funny.
It's a great story, and I've heard sometimes that this collection, if this is the right set of manuscripts, the so-called philosophical collection that Leo the mathematician or his circle might have been involved somehow in the transcribing of, that if we didn't have that, we might not have texts, or at least would have much worse texts of Plato, for example. So the dialogues we're going to read just might not have come down to us if they weren't copied out by hand that much later. Is that true? Does that seem about accurate?
I'm not completely sure about the details of how the argument is going to be built, but there is something that happens in his time that is crucial in rekindling a certain interest in the texts that eventually become our canon. A colleague of mine, Anthony Calvellis, makes this very aggressive argument, and I think he's very right in doing so. Think of what the classical canon is. Think of what all these texts that we consider essential for our understanding of the ancient Greeks are. They're not the texts that the ancient Greeks selected for us to read. They're the texts that the Byzantines, medieval Romans copied and read for themselves because they thought them valuable for various reasons. Ethical, political, ideological, religious. And also they're the texts that the rivals of the Byzantines, the Muslim Caliphate, read for their own reasons. So we have constructed this notion of this Western canon, and happily we're at a moment where we're challenging this idea of a Western canon, on what two cultures that we stereotypically define as Oriental were reading for fun or for their own purposes.
And so this time,
and that is fascinating.
This is a really crucial time for understanding that process of canon formation, and I guess some of the very particular or local pressures that led to these particular texts surviving. Because I guess if it's right, like people have to copy these out by hand, generation after generation. It's a pretty big job. It's not like copy paste.
Yes, and it is an interesting moment. An interesting historic, the 9th century in a way is an interesting historical moment. In what way? After about 150 years of being the punching bag for the Caliphate, the state that we call Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, is finally solid and is able to to experience a certain degree of peace, stability, not fearing a year might be the end of the world. And also, we know from the numismatic record, and you have a fantastic coin collection at UBC that your students can have access to from Byzantium. We know from the numismatic record the economy, if you want to put it in vague terms, is picking up. And this coincides with this moment in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, where for their own needs, the caliphs fund philosophy and fund the translation of Greek texts. Dimitri Goutas make this argument that they need philosophers in order to fight the ulema, to fight the religious authorities and establish their own authority. So Greek philosophy is a tool then for the caliphs to play with their own religious leaders in the caliphate. And because the caliphate can pay way more for scholars than Byzantium, the Byzantines themselves find the leadership, the elite, find themselves in a bit of an existential moment. We are the custodians of all these ancient texts, but the Arabs have more money to deal with them. But finally, we are in relative peace, so we could invest in copying manuscripts, which, as you pointed out, is expensive. So in a way, the clash between two powers and the economic moment in Byzantium might have been behind this rekindling of interest that leads to the copying that allows us to have these texts.
Very interesting. So that's really helpful. And I know we were going to talk about this a bit later, but maybe it's natural to come to some of your research next a few hundred years later, as I understand from that kind of very initial rekindling. Is it right to think that some philosophical texts in particular, like Plato, some of the Neoplatonists, were being studied more and more around, is it the 11th and 12th centuries CE, the circle of Michael Psellos? So I'm wondering, is it sort of similarly, would you explain those developments also in terms of some social and economic pressures? Are there kind of local reasons why those new interests develop then?
Some of these things are idiosyncratic. You mentioned Psellos, and I don't think you could easily pin Psellos down just to his time. He's too special and too peculiar a character to just be pinned to a moment. But his moment is convenient at the same time because he lives in a time where he experiences decline, because in the 11th century Byzantium enters a period of decline, but his career begins at the moment when Byzantium is the most powerful state in Europe and the Near East. And that has very interesting implications because, and here perhaps this is a bit of a social historical analysis of how you can enter into a discussion about philosophy or about texts. In the context of growth, Byzantine emperors need to better manage their state. Let's say the state is hiring in the 11th century because the state needs to manage new populations. Byzantium has doubled from the beginning of the 10th century to the mid-11th century its size. So this population needs to be governed. How does the Roman Empire of the Middle Ages govern? It hires bureaucrats. What is the basic culture consumed by Byzantine bureaucrats? Well, Greco-Roman texts. And the Roman component of those texts, of course, is Roman texts written in Greek. So Polybius, for example, a historian who writes about Rome, becomes crucial as a writer that would allow the Romans of the 10th and 11th centuries to understand their past. The thing is that the moment you start reading Polybius, you're reading an author who is not just a historian, he's thinking about politics in Aristotelian kind of context to some degree. So suddenly, this historical and philosophical tradition is a tradition that helps you understand yourself as a Roman of the Middle Ages. And as the state shifts, as more and more bureaucrats become necessary, people who share a common culture, these bureaucrats can go back to these ancient texts for inspiration about how to imagine politics, how to imagine their own place in politics. So suddenly reading Polybius or Dionysius of Halicarnassus or Diodorus Siculus, and then philosophers might help you conceive a place in the world, especially at a time when it seems that for whatever reason, some sort of questioning of causation becomes possible. So Psellos pushes the envelope and pushes the agenda. How do things happen? And if they happen this way, what is the relationship with religion and so on and so forth? I don't know if that makes sense as a universe of both social developments and ideas.
No, that's wonderful. Really helpful to see like that idea too of we're looking into the mirror of the past, or rather they were looking into the mirror of the sort of classical antiquity in Greek and Roman culture as a way of sort of seeing themselves or telling a story about their place in the world. So it's kind of complex. Both the individual and the collective are involved in that change. It makes me think of something else we were thinking we might talk about in some of our conversations before. In my classes, we've been discussing mythology and the ways that that storytelling and sort of finding meaning in the world can develop from just that sort of thing, I guess, looking into the mirror of the past with history, or also reading some of these myths and events and tales that flow from ancient Greece that lots of people even today grow up with all around the world. And I wondered if, even though it's a bit of a jump, if you might have anything to share with us about the continuity of Greek storytelling mythology from the past, and how those stories, not necessarily just philosophical stories, still resonate, or maybe just how we might approach a big question like that.
I mean, there is so many interesting aspects to this case of myth. I'm thinking of the instructions to, I forget the exact title, but instructions to young men on approaching ancient text by Basil of Caesarea, one of the pillars of kind of orthodox theological thinking. And this is a fascinating text written in the 4th century, where a Christian author educated in the classics, because that was the elite education that you would get if you came from an elite background, has to tackle the tensions between Christian teachings and what you find in classical texts. And what he goes and says is, look, pick from those classical texts, whether they're myths or histories or stories, what will allow you to be a virtuous individual. What I want you to avoid, he goes, is basically the sex and the gods, if you can. But this tension that Basil touches upon on this in this text is kind of crucial, and it tells us something. That even when you don't have a historical text or a philosophical text which logically outlines clear steps on you constructing a good life, the myths themselves were appealing, both because they were simply fun. I mean, and still, most of the students I encounter in my classes for Byzantium, they don't come to me because they know Byzantine history. They come to me because they've had mythology. These myths are simply too good to set aside, whatever we might want to do. But at the same time, they include in them fundamental discussions about what it means to be a virtuous individual, to pursue aretē. And of course, fundamental discussions about the tensions between the individual kind of quest for excellence and the relationship of that individual with the community. In many ways, we still have them, and the Byzantines had them, because within them, once you went past the fun fact that, In the case of pacify, a cow has to be constructed to put a woman in because the bull needs to impregnate her. I mean, these are weird things. Beyond that, within those stories, we find something about the constitution of our communities and the basic tensions that exist in how our communities are constituted. And the people we have come to call the Byzantines were aware of that. And to give you an interesting example, part of the basic rhetorical training of a young person, and of course that young person is a man, this is a gendered society, there is clear exclusion of women from this environment. We need to be very clear about this. Part of their training was, of course, rhetorical training. To have rhetorical training, they had these rhetorical exercises that they constructed. And here you have these individuals whose first text was the New Testament. That's how they learned their first Greek. And then they went to Homer, who are basically asked by their teachers. And here I'm giving you a bit of a constructed story. So that's not exactly how it would have been, but that's the formula. Zeus sexually assaulted a mortal woman, which Zeus tended to do. What you are the lawyer for Zeus. Explain why, on the basis of what you know from myth and history and our legal tradition, Zeus is innocent. And your colleague, Georgios, will have to do the opposite. So the myth, which takes you completely away from Byzantium, and the storytelling, which takes you completely away from Byzantium, becomes the space in which you will discuss very concrete problems and where you will learn how to address your fellow individuals and logically, with reason and erudition, create a community of debate and dialogue.
So it's creating a kind of shared thought world, like a set of assumptions that that whether it's legal or storytelling, philosophy, or even science, that everybody can sort of share in common through, I guess, the vocabulary you're learning, the myths and literature. And I guess in a society, as you were describing, that has a strong strain of bureaucracy, shall we say, that that having that kind of understanding of legal systems early on is important too. Maybe one question sort of connecting with what you were just saying about the degree to which, going back so far, it's a very gendered society, and even that example, obviously when maybe from today, from a modern perspective, we're looking back at the past, we might think that those thought worlds, those mythical thought worlds, are hard to retrieve as a source of meaning when they're laden with assumptions of inequity or those sorts of challenges. Would it be sort of fair to ask for us, or for a modern reader, whether it's still possible to kind of retrieve an underlying meaning, to retrieve morals from stories that on the surface seem very problematic? And I'm kind of asking that in a Platonic spirit, I feel like, because Plato too is, maybe for different reasons, worried about the kind of underlying meaning or the moral implications of traditional mythology, and seems to kind of advance in the Republic this idea that somehow you can recognize that the literal meaning is problematic, and yet possibly learning from the ways it's problematic at the same time, underneath in the kind of, is it like the huponoia, or like the allegorical or underlying meaning, find morals that are still of value. So I guess I'm wondering if it sounds like in some ways Christian readers were able to do that from their point of view, what they found problematic on the surface and valuable underneath. Does it seem like, maybe again it's just too big a question, but a modern reader can find value underneath a problematic myth as well? And if so, how?
I would like to open it up beyond the myth per se, a problematic text, if you want, or sets of texts, and so on and so forth. I've been involved this semester. We're all going through this online thing, and I've been recording lectures for a course on Greek civilization that takes me way back from my Byzantine material, and I've come to encounter, Solon again and think about him.
Yes.
Think about how fascinating it is that he's someone who uses poetry in order to communicate with his contemporaries, because slamming rhyme helps you pass a message more effectively than...
Yes.
So I've been dealing with all that. And ultimately, we come to Solon, who of course had himself a very gendered conception of what a polity is and what a political community is all about. But we come to a discussion that then is picked up throughout Athenian history about isopolitia, sort of equal access to the political community. And it is equal sum. But the logic that gets you to this quest for equality in and of itself is salvageable. The questions asked about who is a citizen, irrespectively of origins and wealth, are still fundamental. Once you take the next logical step, which we've taken, and still struggling for a lot, but at least we've taken some of the steps, then all these can be applicable to equity among everyone on racial, gender, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth questions. The Greeks may not give us a complete emancipatory narrative. Everyone should have access to all rights, but they give us a toolbox for thinking about how to question the restrictions. It's up to us how much we use the scalpel to carve away the layers of prejudice and institutional sort of blocks in our terms of the very present moment of racial discrimination and so on and so forth.
Yes.
I don't know whether this is a satisfactory answer. The Greeks had slaves. The Greeks could express xenophobic opinions, but at the same time, they produced narratives that questioned certainties and established opinions that are still useful.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that there's a continuity of that project of isopolitia, isonomia, kind of equality under the law, seeking equity, even if it was just, in a way, there were beginnings of that project we can see in spirit. And I love the example of Solon, that if we're also seeking justice, that there is a continuity with the kind of underlying spirit of that project. I think that really resonates for me, at least. And even when we are recognizing the limitations that you were framing so eloquently in the past, even that recognition of what was limited, what they might have been blinded to in their own time, maybe is also helpful for us to look at what our blinders might be, even as we make progress. So I really appreciate that perspective.
And I don't know whether the connection is really accurate, but I like the story a lot.
Yes.
And to go back to Psellos, this 11th century intellectual figure, also politician, not necessarily a nice man, but nevertheless. He has a fascinating story, which is the funeral oration for his daughter. She died age 9. And he also has an encomium to his mother. So this is a man who lived in many ways, a man's world. Even though at court in Constantinople, women of aristocratic presence and empresses would have significant roles, who leaves us two very sensitive texts about two female members of his family. And in both of those texts, this person who was clearly aware that men got an education emphasizes how the women in his life sought an education despite everything, and understood as a human living in a gendered society that the only way to describe the women of his family as complete individuals going past the standards of piety and beauty would be to also make them educated. So somehow he makes that jump. It may not have come to shape how he treated other women, we don't know. It may not have come to make his historical narrative a narrative that passes the Bechdel test about, how many female characters there are and how they participate and are the narratives about other men. Yeah, maybe not. But at the same time, he's ready to recognize that if I want my own family's women to appear to readers of future generations as complete, I have to say something about their education. And in doing so, I have to break assumptions about their seclusion.
That makes sense too. This idea of completeness, I was curious about, and maybe this can be one or two last questions, but about, you mentioned aretē and sort of excellence or virtue as a concept that runs through so much of these time periods we're talking about. And at least in a sort of Aristotelian frame, I feel like, and maybe Platonic too, there's a sense that the excellence or virtue of a person or an animal or even really anything has to do with its completeness, or its sort of teleosis, maybe it's reaching its acorn to oak tree likeness. Does Psellos and sort of people in his circle also think along those lines? So is that sort of recognition of, for somebody to be really educated, to go through sort of the process of paideia or education is to become complete, to realize our best potentials? Or is that sort of, I don't know, too simplistic a way of putting it?
I'm not exactly sure if Psellos would have put it in this way, but the one thing that comes out of his writings, and I'm thinking of the texts that, the two documents that he addresses to the patriarch Kyroularios, who is mostly conceived as a culturally conservative figure of the 11th century. He does an interesting play with Kyroularios. He says, look, you, patriarch, are perfect. He's being ironic, but you're perfect. You can have knowledge without pursuing it. You access it directly through God. I cannot be like you. I am earthly, and I need to know everything, and I need to pursue every angle of inquiry in order to be fulfilled. So here you have a Psellos who, first of all, embraces his earthly nature. He's clear about this. In fact, he says, you can rise like Elijah on the chariot towards the skies. I can't. I'm here. But I love being here. And I would not choose anything else but being here. And being here allows me to study my nature as a human being, what I am, and I will push that question into everything. It will be philosophy, it will be science, it will be all manner of knowledge. Foreign knowledge, Chaldean oracles, anything it can be. And that idea of seeking to know everything is, to me, fascinating. Because Psellos is very clear that he has zero martial virtue, which is an essential component of an ancient Greek's construction of aretē. You fight for your state. Psellos tells us, I cannot ride horses. I have traumatic experiences with horses. I don't like being on the campaign trail. He hated following the emperor on the campaign trail, but he constructs his own virtue as knowledge, philosophy, wisdom of all sorts, rhetoric. He makes this essential connection between rhetoric and philosophy. There is no Platonic suspicion of the sophist here. You need rhetoric as far as Psellos is concerned, who is in the Platonic tradition, but still.
To be a whole person in a way, like it's one of those capacities we have to realize. That's really interesting. So go ahead,
No, I was thinking of something else, because we're talking about individuals thinking about expressing themselves and using rhetoric to express themselves. And of course, the ancient Greek world really develops the theory for that. Aristotle leaves us, basic advice on how to do that. And then we have handbooks for rhetoric and how to speechify. And there is this interesting, almost ironic situation. Byzantium has been conceived as this theocratic, quasi-totalitarian state, which of course it isn't. And scholarship is countering that. But one of the very interesting aspects of discovering Byzantium for me has been how powerful this urge to debate was throughout Byzantine history. And how, for all that, yes, there was an emperor who had supreme authority, there was an understanding that you addressed your population, that your population had some sort of feedback. How it happened, it's organic and it's unclear, and sometimes it happened with rebellions. But there was clearly a discursive relationship between emperor and subjects. And the courts were a central space where things were up for debate. And we have emperors who would Leo VI writes at the end of the 9th, beginning of the 10th century, and he has introductions to his laws where he says, we amended this law because it never found acceptance among the general population. So we thought that it should be struck down. Now, once you realize that this is the logic in which this monarchical state operates, you also understand why it is so essential for intellectuals from that period to connect with an ancient Greek rhetorical tradition, because you need to win the debate at court. And then, of course, we enter in other avenues. The same, from the same set of laws, we have this interesting statement: women should not be allowed at court. They should give the positions at home, because the court is such a vibrant space of debate that it would be inappropriate for the modesty of a woman. Moreover, given a woman's license with her tongue, sexist narrative, of course, here, women talk a lot and gossip, etc., putting them at court is going to be trouble for us. But think about what that means about the society. First of all, courts are lively. They're spaces of serious contestation. Keep the women away from that because they're a bit too lively. But then we recognize that women, as a matter of their nature, are capable at that, whether they have rhetorical training or not. So, I mean, the thinking that goes into writing that kind of sentence is so fascinating.
It reveals a lot in the background.
It produces sexist narratives. Yeah.
Yes. Is it, and would it be right to assume that a fairly small minority of the population in that society would have gone through that kind of rhetorical education, like a quarter, a fifth, or or probably smaller number even. The thing is that even if a minority of people went through education, the courts were accessible to everyone. It was a bit more expensive to travel to Constantinople for an appeal. Excuse me. But the courts were accessible to everyone. And from later periods, when we start having the records from Mount Athos, which is this monastic community in the north part of Greece for your students, still kind of a time capsule. It's still almost a state in and of itself, with about 20-something monasteries going back to the 10th century. From Mount Athos, when we look at the records, and we have very interesting records that the monasteries preserved because they were about territorial disputes, we have accounts of trials. And in the trials, you see that there is the educated, snooty judge, and then the villagers present themselves at the court. And of course, the scribe says there was a cacophony because there is a snooty comment on the villagers, but the villagers go to court and find representation. So the villagers participate in this raucous, rhetorical kind of culture all the way to the 12th century. Wow.
And beyond.
So it's some indication of kind of broad access, at least to the courts, which seems important, and the glue holding it all together. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. It raises other questions about how institutions and courts construct identity and so on and so forth. But that's my own course on Byzantium in the Middle Ages.
That sounds great. So I guess so far we've thought a little bit about everything from the kind of pressures on canon formation in the 9th, 10th century and later in Byzantium. We've thought a bit about stories all the way back to ancient Greece and how the interpretation of these and the kind of underlying meaning could still be available to us. I think you've given us this wonderful sense of the atmosphere of some of these Byzantine conversations, even though we're just kind of scratching the surface of what that identity was like. Is there anything else, I know, again, just scratching the surface, you might want to share with us before we close?
I mean, you could be going on with stories on this material for quite a while.
We could go for years.
Yes, I mean, aren't we doing that for our own work?
Yeah.
But fundamentally, if I could say something that ultimately touches upon also my study of kind of authors who write history in the 11th century, if I would say something is that what we see in Byzantium, and of course what we see all the way to our days when people engage with stories from the ancient world, is that it seems that the ancient Greek literary sort of production and philosophical production has consistently been a very good tool for thinking about one's condition. It doesn't matter if you are in an environment that is like the ancient Greek environment. It doesn't matter if the same conditions apply when it comes to religion, geopolitics, political structures, and so on and so forth. But the author I studied, a historian and judge of the 11th century, Michael Psellos, uses ancient authors who write mostly about Rome, not going all the way back necessarily to your period, in order to think about his own situation. Today, think about it, we're talking about the increasing tensions in the relationship between China and the United States. And the political scientists who try to explain it speak of a Thucydides trap. So about this idea that the way in which Athens and Sparta found themselves at war through mutual suspicion, tensions, and proxy conflicts is exactly how we should be understanding a 21st century geopolitical clash. So all the way to if you want, halls of power, and in the academic halls trying to understand modern phenomena, you see people deploying these notions developed in the ancient Greek world in order to better understand their own world. And that, I think, is the greatest compliment that can be made of these ancient Greek authors, that somehow people still find them relevant, both because of the way they thought about things, but also of the way in which they were fun. I mean, come on, Herodotus is sheer fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's still a thought world we can enter into and learn from today.
I would think so. I would think so. And I try to do that myself as much as I can. It is a bit sad that sometimes we have to find justifications. Why do you do that? And you have to develop an elaborate argument about why it matters to study the humanities. But then once you go past the basic rhetorics that you give for administrators, you realize it's both fun and ultimately a good way to think with. So I'll take that.
Can't get much better than that. Dimitris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. This has been great fun.
For me too.
Το τέλος ο χρόνος απέ